All right. Well, it's good to see everyone here. Good to be together. Like Mark said, this is just a good time for us as a church. These Sunday mornings, chance to be together. We are going to finish up today a series that we started some time ago called "The Church So Much More," and we've been taking some time doing this. And the reason is that if what we've been saying about the church is true, then it really has an outsized impact on our life. And so it's worth thinking about. If what we've been saying about the church is true, it really, really changes things for us. Or it can, and it should. You know, we just had an election that we spent year and a half, I don't know, people thinking about it and chewing on it and talking about it and engaging in it and analyzing it. And rightly so, because elections have a big impact on our country, which then has a big impact on our lives. And so, of course, we would spend a lot of time thinking and chewing on these elections. But I believe if what we're saying about the church is true, that the church has an even bigger impact on our lives. Because the election affects our world now, the things that we see practically every day. It does, and so it's important. The church impacts what we see now, but it also impacts eternity. Church is one of those intersections between the physical world that we live in now and the eternal world that we also live in. God made us spiritual beings. You and I are going to live forever, and we're part of that spiritual world, and the church is one of the intersections of that. So to think about it and chew on it and to pour through it, I think is very, very important. So we've been doing that. We've been spending a fair amount of time talking about the church. This is the last day. We're gonna finish up today. As always, there is a study guide out there if you want to grab one and follow along. This will go through the message that we're going through today. Also out there on that back table, I printed off a short little 3-page article that actually Mark sent to me, and it's called "Love the Church Like Jesus." And it's interesting because it catches a lot of the things we've talked about so far, and even some of the things that we're going to talk about today, written by a guy named David Mathis. So if you're interested in this, I printed off a dozen or so copies back there. If you want to grab one, go ahead and read it. If you want one and can't, and they're all gone, you can track me down and I will get you one. Okay. I'm out of breath and we haven't even started yet. We're going to finish up today. Last week we ended with, or last week we were talking about how do I engage in the church. We spent many weeks talking about what the church is, all these things. Last week we talked about how do I engage in the church, and we ended here. This is a summary of what that looks like. How do we engage with the church? Well, since the church is a family, I commit relationally. Since the church is a nation, I pledge myself loyally. Since the church is an army, I endure courageously. Since the church is a body, I serve faithfully. That's where we ended up. That was the summary of last week's message. But we also recognized that if you look at those things and if you think about all of those things, committing relationally, pledging yourself loyally, enduring courageously, serving faithfully, when you look at that and begin to think about it, all right, what does that mean for me? What does that look like for me? I think it raises questions. And we are going to look at some of those questions today. And last week we raised 3 questions, and here they are. Okay, but what about when the world pushes back? What about when the church goes bad? And what about when people leave? So today we're going to try to answer those questions, and there are probably other ones. As we really think about this, anything that's important raises all kinds of questions. Anything that's important raises all kinds of potential concerns. Anything that's important does that. That's why elections are so contentious sometimes, because it's important. Well, this is important. If the church is as important as God says that it is, then it's going to raise questions. These aren't the only ones. But they're pertinent ones, I think, ones that probably all of us ask ourselves, and so it's worth looking at. So that's what we're going to do today. For the next few minutes, we're going to try to answer these questions, okay? So, first one, what about when the world pushes back on all the things that we've said about the church? Well, it's going to happen. The church is going to push back on us. You know, if you commit relationally, if you really do that, it can look like a cult, can't it? I'm committed to those people, and I'm just going to stay here with these people. That can look like a cult, and it can be called a cult. If you pledge loyally, if you really say, I'm going to let my king help me to understand how to think, and I'm going to give myself to his interests, and I'm going to work hard for him, well, that can sound like you're being brainwashed, doesn't it? Can't it? It can. If you're going to endure courageously, the church is an army, so I'm going to allow myself to be commanded, and I'm going to put myself in danger. Well, that sounds like abuse, perhaps. And if the church is a body, I'm going to serve faithfully. I'm going to take what I have, and I'm going to submit myself to all those around me and to the head, and I'm going to serve and pour myself out. Well, that sounds perhaps like it's controlling, doesn't it? And the world can and will push back. And for generations, those things have been said about the church. It's a cult. It brainwashes the people who are in it if you're not careful. It's easily and often abusive. It is controlling. It's just trying to get out of you. Those are accusations against the church, and they come from the world. And again, they're not novel. I would say that those accusations against the church have been happening for generations, perhaps millennia. Ever since the church began, those things have been said about it. So how do we handle that? What do we do? Well, first thing is this. I don't think we should be surprised by that, or somehow be shocked that the world says those things about the church. Here's why. The church is different than anything else in the world. And it makes sense if the church is what we said that it was. If the church is a very physical thing, you know, we see it, we understand it, we engage in it, and yet it's a portal into that spiritual world. So it's spiritual and it's physical all at the same time in ways that nothing else is. We just have to recognize that the church is different than anything else in the world. This verse here in 1 Peter 2, verses 9 through 11, it says this, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God." I read that again. "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world." We just need to recognize that the church is different, and we've said that all along. It's a nation, and we are citizens of that nation. It's like if you left the United States and moved tomorrow to pick a country. Someone throw out a country name. You move to Australia. At least you speak the language. But if you move to Australia, you're going to have to get used to a completely different culture, a completely different set of norms, a completely different set of laws. How much more so if you move to somewhere where they don't even speak English? Now you got to learn a completely new language. We live in a different country. That's what this says. We are a royal priesthood, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation of people belonging to God. It is not like anything else. The church is not like anything else. And I tried to think of an example of this. And the best I could come up with, and this is probably not a great example, but it's like a platypus. A platypus is a really odd beast. It's a mammal that looks like a bird that acts like a reptile. It lays eggs, and yet it nurses its young. It looks like a duck, right? I mean, if you've seen a platypus, I don't have a picture. I should have a picture of a platypus here, but I don't. So the males, it's the only mammal that is venomous. Male platypi are venomous. Did you know that? They're not cuddly. Don't try to grab one. It'll sting you. It's just a weird thing. It kind of defies a lot of the norms. And so when you look at it, you think, well, I guess it's a mammal, but not really, because it lays eggs. And I guess it's just a very, very odd thing. It's different than everything else. The church is different than anything else. There's nothing like it in the world. There's nothing like it in the world. And that there's nothing like it in the world because of what we said. It is something very spiritual. It's a real thing. It is Christ's bride, Christ's body, God's voice. All of these things that we said it is, that's different than just an organization. There are all kinds of places you can go and meet with people and do things. You can go to the senior center. You can go to the gym. You can go to the movies. You can go to the farmer's market where people gather together and do something. Well, isn't that just what this is? We're gathering together and doing something? No, because what we are doing is becoming the bride of Christ. It's different. We're becoming the body of Christ. It's different. We are the voice of God. It's different. The church is different than anything else in the world. Because of that, it's going to seem foolish and wrong to much of the world. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, this whole chapter is interesting because he's talking about the difference between that spiritual realm that the church is part of and the physical, temporary realm that much of our world is part of. In 1 Corinthians 2:14, he says this, "The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned." Remember what we just read? We are a royal priesthood. We are a people chosen by God, a holy nation. It's something different. If we have accepted Christ and become part of the church, by accepting Christ, God says His Spirit lives inside of you, and we become awake and alive spiritually in ways that we weren't before. All of us, because of our sin, are dead. We're dead spiritually. We are separated from God. Only when we accept Christ and our sin is paid for, that's why it says we're born again, because spiritually we become alive again, and now God's Spirit lives in us, and we interact with God's Spirit in ways that we couldn't before. So the church is hearing something and feeling something and experiencing something that the world cannot feel because they do not have the spiritual awakening that we do. The world is going to look at the church and say, not only is it different, but I don't get it, and it looks foolish. It looks foolish because they can't understand it. That's what God is saying here. It's just a different thing. So it's going to seem foolish and it's going to seem wrong to the world. And that is going to, it often, and in fact Jesus tells us that it will, generate fear and anger. And the world is going to push back on it. In John 15, when Jesus is just about to leave the world, he's talking to his disciples, and he warns them of that. He says this, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name." Jesus was very clear that because we've been chosen out of the world, because we're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people chosen by God, because of that, there are some people who reject that. And what they reject is God himself. That's what Jesus is saying. They rejected him. And he tells them something because he tells us, told his disciples there, and this comes straight to you and I. If the world hated me, if the world hated Jesus, they're going to hate his people. They're going to hate his nation. They're going to hate his bride. They're going to hate his body. They don't want to hear his voice. So we shouldn't be surprised if and when the world pushes back on what the church is. Because it's all the things that seem foolish and they don't understand, and to the degree that they do, they hate it if they've rejected Christ. And so they're going to look at us and they're going to say, you're a cult, you're brainwashed. That's an abusive thing. You're being controlled. You're a dupe. Whatever. We should not be surprised when we hear that. Because Jesus said that's what the world's going to do. That's what they said about him. He's a fool. He's a lunatic. He's a liar. We shouldn't be surprised at all. And maybe one way to think about it is this: we can't do church in a way that makes sense to the world. We can't do church in a way that is acceptable to the world because it's something that they don't accept. Because they can't. I'm not trying to bash anybody, but if you don't have God's Spirit, that's what God said. It's foolish. It doesn't make sense. If you have rejected Christ, well, you reject this. We cannot do church the way that God says church should be done in a way that makes sense and is acceptable to the world. Not the way God wants it to be done. Because it doesn't make sense and it's been rejected by the world. So, how do we respond to that? Well, first, don't be afraid. I love this verse in Isaiah 51. I ran into this years ago, and I think of it often. It's one of the verses that I write down and carry around with me. It says, "Hear me, you who know what is right, you people who have my law in your hearts." That's us. That's you and I, God's people. God's Spirit, God's law is inside of us. He speaks to us. "Hear me, you folks, my church. Do not fear the reproach of men or be terrified by their insults." I just like that. It's God telling me, hey, Rob, church, I'm with you. My Spirit is in you. You're going to be insulted. You're going to be reproached. They're just mortal men. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't fear when the world says these things. Don't panic. We can panic. I think, oh my gosh, I don't want to be a cult. I don't want to be thought of as a dupe. I don't want to be looked at and have the world say I'm an idiot. Well, they're gonna. That's what Jesus said. So, how do I respond? Well, one thing is I'm not going to be afraid. God help me not to be afraid. We talked about that enduring courageously last week. But that's the first thing. Don't be afraid. And the second thing, I think, and we've talked about this a lot through this as well, is we need to ask God to help us to see and believe the truth. You know, if I really, truly believe, if I really, truly believe that I'm bulletproof, I'm not going to be afraid of a man with a gun, am I? If you really, truly believe that what God says about the church and you and I is true, if we really believe it, well, then somebody telling me I'm foolish, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter because I see the truth and I believe it. So we have to see and believe the truth. We looked at this verse in 2 Kings. Remember, we're talking about a spiritual thing in this physical world, and we have to be able to see a little bit outside of the norm. We have to let God help us to see something that maybe we wouldn't see otherwise. And we read this verse in 2 Kings when Elijah, the prophet, was doing God's will, and the world hated him for it, and they came after him. And the king of Aram sent his army to seize Elisha, and the servant wakes up and sees the army arrayed against him, and this whole army has come to take this guy, this bald guy. Elisha, well, man, we're cooked, said the servant. We are cooked. Look at it's an army. We have no chance. Elisha prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes so he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. There is a reality. People, there is a reality. The spiritual world is real. It is not, it's not something we pretend. It's not something that we make up to make ourselves feel better. It is real. And so I pray a lot, Lord, open my eyes. Help me to see and help me to believe. So what that looks like often for me, what that looks like for us, I think, is to hear and experience God's truth. We hear it first through this. This is one of the reasons we talk so much about reading this book. We talk about the spiritual world being real. This is another one of those intersections between the spiritual and the physical. We said that the church is one. This is another one. The Bible is just a book, right? I have hundreds of books. I love books. I read books all the time. If you come to my house, they're everywhere. Dozens and dozens of books, and they all look the same. It's a binding and some pages with words on the page. That's all this is, right? Wrong. God's Spirit is in this. This book is alive spiritually in a way that no other book is. That's what he says. And so when you read this book, you hear the voice of God. This is the beginning. This is the beginning of you hearing God's voice. If you want to hear God, you start here. I believe you start here. So you ask God, show me what's true here, Lord. And then you choose to believe it and say, okay, I'm going to take that as true. Now help me, God, to experience it. Help me to see it as I live my life. If you do those two things, if you go to God and say, show me something from your word, when I see it, I'm going to accept it. But then, Lord, as I walk through the world, I just need you to help me experience it. If you do those two things, help me to hear and help me to experience, what it does is it helps you to see and believe. It cements your belief, your understanding. My gosh, this stuff is true. God, you said it. And because you've opened my eyes, I'm seeing it. I'm experiencing it. If you see and believe, you don't have to be afraid of what the world says. Because if God says this is true, well then, I'm going to believe him, and I'm going to experience all the goodness of it. If the church really is a family, it's not a cult. Is my family a cult? I am uber committed to my kids. I love them unconditionally. Is my family a cult? Is your family a cult? Of course not. How foolish. Well, if the church really is a family, it's not a cult either. But we have to see and believe. We have to let God convince us and show us the truth of these things so that we can say, I'm not going to be afraid when the world pushes back, and because I'm not afraid, I won't be moved. I won't be moved. I will walk in this truth. We looked at that verse last week. Teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. That's a good verse for this. When the world pushes back, don't be surprised. Don't be afraid. Ask God to help you see and believe the spiritual truth. All right. Second question. What about when the church goes wrong? If you engage in the church the way we said, if you commit yourself relationally, if you pledge yourself loyally to say, God, you tell me what's true, and then I'm going to make those my truths. If you endure courageously, put yourself in the chain of command, be willing to step out and put yourself in danger. If you serve faithfully and say, I'm going to really pour myself out for the benefit of those around me. If you do those things, you become vulnerable. You do. Now, in a perfect world, that wouldn't matter. In an absolutely perfect world, it wouldn't matter that you make yourself vulnerable because there would be no danger that you would be taken advantage of. There would be no danger that it would go poorly. The problem is that we don't live in that perfect world. And in fact, God's perfect church is made up of very imperfect people. And that's the first thing we have to understand when we think about what happens what about when the church goes wrong. We need to recognize that though God's bride is beautiful and perfect, though his voice is true and strong and compassionate and filled with justice, though God's body is healthy and moving, all of those things are made up of very imperfect people. Here in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7, it says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." You know, it's one of the great mysteries we've said in this series more than once, that the church, it's somewhat of a mystery. That's one of the reasons we have to chew on it and think about it, because it's a bit of a mystery. God says that. Well, here's one of those mysteries. Why and how does God use such imperfect people to make his perfect bride, his perfect body, his perfect voice? The why I think I can understand. Why does he use us? It's because he loves us, just like I would ask my kids to do things knowing that they weren't perfect at it, but I wanted to engage with them. It was a good thing to help them grow. But maybe the bigger question, the bigger mystery for me is how. How in the world does God use the church when it's so filled with imperfect people, including me and you? You see, we are all capable, you and I are capable of all the things the world says the church could become. We just have to acknowledge that. We're capable of all those things. We are capable of becoming cult-like. We are capable of being brainwashed and brainwashing. We are capable of being abusive. We are capable of being controlling. That's just the truth, because we are imperfect. Getting saved does not make us perfect. We still wrestle. We still live in this broken, fallen world, and we are capable of those things. We are these jars of clay. There's this unsurpassing treasure of the church, Christ's bride, this beautiful thing, Christ's body, God's voice. It's in these jars of clay, you and I. We are desperately not perfect, and we are capable of all of those things that the world would push back on us for. That's true of the leaders in the church. Here in Timothy, Paul spends a lot of time talking about that, about those who lead the church. In 1 Timothy 4, verse 2, he's talking about people in the church, leaders in the church, teachers in the church, and this is what he said: "Such teachings come through hypocritical liars, whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron." He's speaking about leaders in the church, hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared with a hot iron. That is not good. It's not good. And the truth is, the leaders in any church are at best flawed and could go there. That's the truth. But that's not just true of the leaders. It's true of the congregation as well. We share equally, all of us, in that ability. And in Galatians chapter 1, verse 6, and Paul spends a lot of time talking about this too. Galatians chapter 1, verse 6, he says this to a whole church: "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and turning to a different gospel," which is really no gospel at all. An entire church just went off the rails. They gave up on the gospel, on the truth, on the foundational core of what Christianity is all about, what the church was supposed to be about, letting Christ save us from our sins and growing in that family. The whole church just, we're going to believe something totally different. So the problem that we face is that, just what I said, God's perfect church is made up of imperfect people. That is capable of all the things that the world says it could become. That is capable of missing all of the good that God says it can and should be. So, how do we respond to that? What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, the first thing I think we need to recognize is that the issue is not if the church goes bad. The issue is, what do you do when the church goes bad? And by going bad, I don't mean completely exploding and, going, but I do mean gets off track, does things that are hurtful, does things that are not godly. Not if that happens in the church, but when it happens in the church. And Jesus tells us, I think, he gives us an understanding of that here in Matthew chapter 18. I'm going to read a few verses here, beginning with verse 14. This is Jesus talking to us in the church. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. You see, the goal in this here, when the church goes bad, the goal is reconciliation. The goal is resolution. See, the issue is never will the church go bad. The issue is this: how hard will you and I work to make it right? I want to say that again, because I think this is important. The issue in any church you're in is not if there are going to be things that are done poorly, wrongly, incorrectly, meanly, sinfully. That will happen because there are limited, wrong, sinful people in the church. The issue is never in the church you're in if something goes bad. The issue is, how hard are we willing to work to make it right? The goal is reconciliation, not accusation. The goal is reconciliation, not accusation. Look at what he said. If your brother sins against you, that's your brother. This is the family. This is God's family. When your brother sins, not against someone else, against you, and it hurts you, and you feel the weight of it, what do? I go to my brother. That's hard. That's hard because when someone hurts you, you don't want to go to them. You don't like the conflict. You don't want to be hurt again. And Jesus says, go. Why? Because if he listens to you, what happens? You've won your brother. There is reconciliation. There is resolution. But if that doesn't work, you're not done. Now take some others. Find some others. Why? Because we are a body. We need each other. Different people have different gifts and different understandings. Bring it to them. Bring them in and talk to your brother. Again, not to beat him down, but to get to the point where you've won your brother over and there is resolution and there is reconciliation. If that doesn't work, you're still not done. You're in an army. Now go to those in authority. Bring them into it, not to beat this person down or not to prove who's right or wrong, but to what? Win your brother. So there's resolution and reconciliation. The goal when the church goes wrong is to resolve it. And the question is not if the church will go wrong. The question is, how hard will you and I work to make it right? How many times should you forgive your brother? Jesus was asked. 7 times? Peter asked him that question. And I think Peter probably thought, I'm going to pick a number that, I'm going to show him how forgiving I am. 7 times. I'll forgive my brother 7 times. No, Jesus said, no. 7 times 7, 70 times 7. As often as your brother sins, you go. As often as he repents, you accept it. The goal is resolution, not accusation, not proving who's right. Will the church go wrong? You bet. How hard will you and I work to make it right? Because we can. We can. But there's another thing here I think is important for us to recognize, and that's this. When the church goes wrong, we have to be willing to examine ourselves. Because very often, part of what happened anyhow when the church went wrong is you went wrong. The church is made up of imperfect people. That's not just everybody else. That's not just the one sitting next to you. Yeah, he's imperfect. Whew. Don't I know it? Well, you are too. In 1 John 1:8, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. We just have to be willing to recognize that, when things go wrong in the church, it's very possible that I am at least part of it, maybe a big part of it, maybe the major part of it. That's possible. And we have to be willing to accept that. And I think that that's necessary if we're going to do the first part there. If we're going to do that Matthew 18 thing where Jesus said, if your brother sins against you, go to your brother. Okay, I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to go to my brother. And I'm going to take my courage in my hands and go to this man or woman who has hurt me, who has sinned against me, and I felt the weight of it. And I'm going to seek to work it out and to make it right. Not to beat him down, not to prove him wrong, not to get my pound of flesh out of him, but to win my brother. I'm going to do that, though it's scary and though it's hard. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to do all of these things. I'm working very hard. I'm carrying lots of weight to win my brother so that this family is united. This body works together. This army moves forward. I'm working hard at it, but you have to be willing to work just as hard when someone comes to you and says, you have sinned against me. Will you take that? Will you accept that? Will you be one? It's sometimes, a couple weeks ago, we talked about in the church, we have to forgive each other radically. We have to radically forgive each other. But here's what is maybe even harder. We have to be willing to be radically forgiven. The reason that's hard is if I have to be radically forgiven, it means I've done something egregious. Are you willing to admit that at times you do something that is just wrong and bad and sinful, that sometimes you are the one who has sinned against your brother? Sometimes you are the one that needs to be won over. Sometimes you are the one that needs to be radically forgiven. If we're not willing to go there, Matthew 18 won't work. That reconciliation, that resolution won't work because both sides have to be humble and go and resolve. Examine yourself. Be willing to examine yourself. And recognize that sometimes when the church goes wrong, I went wrong. I did, because I'm that imperfect person that Christ loves, that Christ longs for you and I to be in his bride, part of his voice, part of his body, but I am imperfect, and I need to be forgiven. Sometimes the hard work of making it right is I need to humble myself. Third question, final question. What happens, okay, but what about when people leave? It's interesting, at the end of Matthew 18 there, you do get to a point where people leave, right? I mean, sometimes things go wrong and people leave. And the truth is, and if the church is a family, well, no. You don't leave my family. If the church is a body, no. I'm not just going to jettison body parts. If the church is an army, no, you can't just go off and do your own thing. If the church is a nation, no, I can't just go make my own nation and fight. That doesn't happen. It should never happen, right? I mean, if all the things we said the church is, if that's really true, then no one should ever leave. So what about when people do? How do we handle that? Well, a couple things. We need to recognize, I think, that it will happen. It's going to happen. In Acts chapter 15, Paul wrote much of the New Testament. Barnabas was his partner. Barnabas was a guy, if you read through Acts, I mean, Paul was a radical. Paul Paul was this guy that was scary. People were scared of him for good reason. Part of it was his history. Part of it was his personality, I think. He was just this wild-eyed radical. And when he got saved, when Paul was confronted with Jesus and bowed his knee and recognized he was a sinner and let Christ pay the penalty for his sins, when Paul was born again spiritually and became part of that family, the other people in it looked at him and said, "I don't think so. You're nuts. We're afraid of you." Barnabas is the one who went and got Paul and said, No, he got saved. Look, Barnabas and Paul worked together for years. They pastored together in Antioch. And then when Paul just had this vision from God, we need to go out into the world and share this message, Barnabas went with him. These guys were partners. They were buddies. I'm sure that Paul and Barnabas thought we were going to be together for the rest of our lives. I suspect that anyhow. And yet here in Acts chapter 15, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers. They left. Somebody left. People will leave. There are good reasons to leave a church. There are. We saw it in Matthew. That was one of them. There can be good reasons or necessary reasons. There can be bad reasons to leave a church. Oftentimes it's unclear. When a person leaves a church, very often it's unclear. Well, was that a good reason or a bad reason? I don't know. Theologians have debated. There are books written about that little passage there. Who was right, Paul or Barnabas? I don't know. Sometimes it's just unclear. But the reality is that people will leave. People that have become part of your family. People that have become part of your body. People that you have labored alongside. People that you have defended and have defended you. People that you have been in that bride of Christ together with will choose to leave. It will happen. And when it happens, I think we need to acknowledge that it will hurt. It's just going to hurt. Sometimes I think we wish that it didn't, and that we could just have it not mean anything. But again, if we're doing church right, I think it's going to hurt. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians. In Corinthians, Paul is writing to a church that he had stayed there for many years. He had poured his life into this church, and now this church is beginning to turn away from Paul. Not just away from him, but even against him. There is antagonism toward Paul. And he says this in chapter 7, 2 Corinthians 7, 2 and 3. He says, "Make room for us in your hearts." When I read this, I just hear a longing on Paul's side. Make room in us for your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die for you. See, if we do church right, we have that heart toward people. I will live and die for you. I will pour out my life for you. And I find joy in your presence, and I find joy in your gifting, and I find joy in you. And if one of us goes, if we're parted, it's just going to hurt. It hurts relationally. It hurts emotionally. It hurts functionally. You don't take a part out of your body without having pain and without missing that part. I had 2 teeth taken out. And the doc said, this is going to hurt a lot. And now I got 2 big holes in my mouth. I don't chew as well as I used to. When people leave, it's going to hurt. Relationally, emotionally, functionally. You can't escape that. I wish we could, but we live in this imperfect world. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Well, I love this passage in Romans 12. I'll read it here. It's a little long. I'm going to start reading in verse 9. It says, "Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." There was so much in there, but I think that's the blueprint, or that's the manual for how all of us respond when people choose to leave. For good reasons, bad reasons, or unclear reasons, I'm going to choose to love them anyhow. And I hope that they choose to love me. I will bless them. I will trust that God is going to do good for them, and I will hope and pray that God will do good for them. I'll pray patiently. I will endure. I'll bless and not curse. I will hope for the best. I will look forward to the day that someday we're together in heaven. There are people in my life that, and all of us know this, where, you know what, I just don't see them now. And there's something there, but Lord, I just pray that they would do well. Do you pray for the people who maybe left, and hope and trust that God is using them? Did they leave for a good reason, a bad reason, or an unclear reason? I don't think it matters. You are my brother, whether you're here or you're over there. You and I are part of Christ's bride. You and I are part of his body. You and I are part of his voice. I will not think evilly of you, but I'll hope God uses you, that you are growing in your relationship with God. I will trust that God can take you where you are and take me where I'm at, and we can both move forward with the Lord. I will live at peace with you. Maybe we need to do that Matthew 18 thing. You know what? There's something between us. Okay, we'll try to work that out. Fine. But if I end up somewhere and you end up somewhere else, I will still love you. I will bless you. I will trust in God, and I will hope for God's goodness. Even though it hurts. Even though it hurts. We've spent many weeks on this series. And you know, we've said a lot of things. And I have said some things that maybe are controversial. I've said some things that maybe make you think. I've said some things that you probably disagree with. Maybe. I hope, though, this is the last thing I'm going to say in this whole series, and I've shared this verse more than once. It's in Acts chapter 17, verse 11. It's this: "Now the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the Scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true." If what we've said from the stage is true, it is worth you finding out. If what we've said is true, it is so worth finding out, because it makes a difference in your life. And so I pray and hope that you will go to God, you will go to the Scriptures, you will talk to God and say, "Lord, is this true?" And if he says yes, then ask the next question: "Lord, what does it mean to me? How do I respond to that?" Because I believe this church, this little church right here, and that church, and all the churches, all these little churches, have an outsized impact on your life, on my life and on the world because of what God says this is, and because of what God can and wants to and will do with us here. I believe it's a mystery. But it is a mystery that we can understand because God's Spirit lives inside of us, and He can speak to us, and He can help us see, and He can help us know, He can help us believe, and He can help us respond. And I pray that you and I would. Let's pray. Father, I just praise you that you can and do speak to us. Our hunger, Lord, is to hear your voice, to feel your touch, to follow you in this world, to grow closer to you every day, become more and more like you. And I thank you, God, that you ask us to do that together. None of us off by ourselves, but together. As a body, as a family, as a nation, as an army. Help us to do that, Lord, to honor you, to bless each other, and to impact the world. Those aren't grandiose things. That's what you want to do. We can honor you. We can bless each other. We can impact the world. Help us to do it in Jesus' name. Amen.